On the evening of July 15, 1976, at the police station in the city of Chila, California, USA, a series of missing person reports were recorded. The common point among those reported missing was that they were all elementary school students from Dairyland and were all on the bus that was supposed to bring them home after a swimming class at summer camp. This bus was driven by a driver named Frank Edward Ray. Strangely, after a period of searching, it seemed that the driver and the 26 children had vanished into thin air, as if a sinister hand had spirited the bus and everyone on it away to another world. To understand what happened, let us delve into the events that transpired. On the afternoon of July 15, 1976, as usual, parents stood at the bus stops to pick up their children returning from summer camp. However, it was strange that even after 30 minutes had passed, there was still no sign of the familiar yellow school bus that carried the Dairyland elementary students. An hour later, after contacting the school, it was confirmed that the bus had left the camp on time. The parents began to sense something was terribly wrong. They became increasingly anxious and, after some contemplation, decided to report the incident to the police. The instincts of these parents told them that something awful might have happened to the bus. So where had the bus carrying 26 elementary students, including 7 girls and 19 boys, along with the driver named Ray, gone? The story likely needs to go back to the time before the parents realized their children had not returned home. It was around 3:30 p.m. on July 15, 1976. Under the scorching summer sun of California, the bus carrying 26 Dairyland elementary students was making its way on the familiar route from the lake back home. On the bus, the children were happily chatting and playing with the driver, Ray. However, Ray suddenly noticed a white van blocking the road ahead. The van looked somewhat old, with long scratches running along its side like claw marks. For a moment, Ray thought the van might have broken down. With this in mind, Ray slowly drove towards it, contemplating whether or not to stop, and ultimately decided to check the situation, unaware that this decision would lead to deep regret. As Ray opened the door and took a few steps out, 3 men with black hoods and handguns suddenly emerged from the van, rushing toward Ray. One of them pointed a gun at him, while the other 2 restrained him and forced him to lead them onto the bus. The 3 men appeared to be Americans, with one taller than the others, seemingly the leader. They boarded the bus, threatening the children and demanding they hand over any electronic devices. They then forced Ray to drive according to their directions along Highway 21, with one of the men driving the white van closely behind. Among the 26 children on the bus, the oldest was only 14, while the youngest, a little girl named Monica, was just 5 years old. She was too young to comprehend the dire situation they were in. The journey stretched longer than usual. Initially, the children continued to joke and play, unaware of the impending danger. As time passed, the children began to feel afraid. Confronted with the 2 masked men with guns, the children started to realize this was not a game. Every minute on the bus felt increasingly heavy. At 4:15 p.m., the attackers ordered Ray to stop the bus. Before Ray was a dark, deep drainage tunnel, emitting a foul odor of waste mixed with decomposing animal remains. The 3 masked men forced Ray and the children into 2 other vehicles waiting there. These vehicles had their windows taped over with black tape and reinforced with wooden planks, resembling impenetrable fortresses from the inside. Once the doors closed, the interior plunged into darkness. Ray was now extremely panicked. He had no idea if these men simply wanted to abduct them or intended to make them victims of some twisted, sadistic game. The vehicle carrying 27 people rushed away. Ray and the 26 children were trapped in the cramped, suffocating space. This vehicle was like a moving coffin, devoid of light and external sound, save for a ventilation tube to prevent suffocation. Some children began to cry softly, while others, feeling sick and scared, vomited. The air inside was thick with the smell of vomit and waste. Ray lost track of time and direction. The older children comforted the younger ones, with some of them pressing their faces against the blackened windows, hoping to glimpse something of the outside world. After about 11 hours, the vehicle stopped. The two trucks transporting Ray and the children had left the Chowchilla area, California, and reached Livermore, California, approximately 100 miles northwest of Chowchilla. The circuitous route ensured Ray and the children had no idea where they were. Finally, the vehicle stopped, and the sound of metal locks clicking was heard. As the door swung open, the masked men banged on the side of the truck with the butts of their guns, ordering those inside to step out. In the dim light, Ray saw they were on a barren, gravelly plot. Here, they forced Ray to state his full name, date of birth, and home address, and to leave behind his shoes and clothes. They then led him to a deep underground bunker. Ray hesitated, but they jabbed him sharply in the ribs, forcing him to descend. He walked down a wooden ladder into the bunker, which was about 12 feet deep. Inside the bunker, under the dim light of a hanging lamp, Ray realized it was the cabin of a truck. The cabin had a few old mattresses, flashlights, some water, and bread. At the back, there was a makeshift toilet. The walls of the cabin bore long scratch marks, as if made by fingernails, and brown stains resembling dried blood, creating a chilling sight. The cabin had a ventilation fan to provide limited air for them to breathe. Ray understood that if the soil shifted or any debris blocked the ventilation pipe, they would quickly suffocate. He realized that if he and the children didn't escape soon, the limited oxygen supply would pose a grave risk. The children were brought down into the cabin one by one, also leaving their personal belongings outside. One girl even had a lock of her hair cut off by the abductors. Once all the children were herded into the bunker, the kidnappers gave them a cold, lingering gaze, then slammed the hatch shut and covered it with soil to keep the cabin hidden. Left in the pitch-black cabin, Ray and 26 children faced countless fears. The unidentified masked men left them in the deep bunker and disappeared. Ray and the children in the cabin had no idea how they were abducted and where they were, but Ray knew that their lives were threatened with every passing minute. Ray tried to comfort the children, assuring them that they would soon be rescued and that everyone outside was trying to save them. However, the next hours in the cabin were filled with anxiety and fear as everyone tried to stay strong to find a way out of this dark trap. While most of the children were extremely frightened and panicked, suddenly, 14-year-old Michael Marshall began to calm everyone down. He sang and told stories to soothe the children. At this moment, Ray was truly impressed by the boy, for in this situation, even an adult like him was scared. But a 14-year-old boy could become a pillar of support for everyone. Time passed heavily, and the children fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. Imagine waking up one day to find yourself in a cramped coffin buried deep underground. No matter how much you scream or claw at the coffin lid until your nails bleed, you can't escape the confined space. And then you would slowly die there, unknown to anyone. How horrifying would that be? When the space returned to stillness, Marshall spoke to Ray about his intention to find a way out. The boy and Ray started to recall if there was any favorable spot for digging out before they descended into the bunker. After some thought, both Marshall and Ray remembered a makeshift toilet. They thought they might be able to dig an escape route through that hole, but it turned out to be a shallow pit, blocked by soil underneath. Then, they came up with the idea of stacking mattresses high enough to reach the entrance on the ceiling of the bunker, from where they could dig their way to the surface. They acted very quietly, fearing the kidnappers might still be around and could kill them if they heard any noise. They wedged a piece of wood found in the truck between the hatch and the cabin, then used all their strength to slide it aside until it created a gap large enough for a person to crawl through. In this life and death moment, Ray was deeply moved by the image of Marshall, the brave and determined boy. Despite exhausting himself by continuously digging through the dirt, Marshall only took brief rests before resuming his efforts. Perhaps when people are pushed to the brink, even a child can summon a fierce survival strength. After many efforts, when it felt like they were close to breaking through to the surface but encountered a wooden crate blocking the way, Ray and the children decided to dig around it. They took turns digging, and after 16 hours of being buried alive, at 8 p.m. on July 16, 1976, the first ray of light pierced their dark world. At this moment, Ray and the 26 children burst into tears of happiness. Marshall once again demonstrated his courage by volunteering to go out first to see if the kidnappers were still around. When he managed to poke his head out, he breathed a sigh of relief as there was no one in sight, only an empty, barren field. He then signaled for the other children to crawl out one by one. Ray was the last to emerge. They lay on the ground, savoring the fresh air of freedom. Their next task was to quickly find a way to escape. Suddenly, Ray heard the sound of a bulldozer. He led the children towards the noise. The quarry workers who were working the night shift were stunned to see a group of people in a terrible state appear in the night. It took them a moment to gather themselves, and after hearing Ray's explanation, they believed him and rushed to bring Ray and the children into their shelter while simultaneously calling the police and ambulances. The police quickly arrived and took all the children and Ray to safety. At the police station, after hearing the accounts of the hostages, they quickly identified and arrested the suspects. The three suspects were Frederick Woods, the son of the quarry owner, and his two friends, brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld. Among the three, only Richard Schoenfeld turned himself in immediately after learning that the police were investigating him. His brother was arrested in Moe Park, California, near the quarry. Meanwhile, Frederick Woods was apprehended in Vancouver, Canada. The investigation's findings shocked the public. Specifically, the perpetrators had kidnapped and nearly buried alive 27 people to demand a $5 million ransom. Ironically, the three criminals came from wealthy families, particularly Frederick Woods. Due to their affluent backgrounds, they had indulged in reckless spending and gambling, accumulating significant debts. But to prove to their parents that they could make money on their own, they devised this elaborate kidnapping plan. They had spent time studying the daily route of the bus, leading to a meticulously planned and executed crime. They even felt excited as if they were acting in a blockbuster movie. After the investigation and prosecution, all three perpetrators were sentenced to life in prison. The Schoenfeld brothers were paroled in 2014 and 2015 respectively, while Frederick Woods was denied parole for not recognizing the severity of his crime. More than 40 years after the incident, the 26 victims continued to suffer severe psychological repercussions. They struggled to return to their normal lives. Michael Marshall, the brave boy from that day, became heavily addicted to alcohol, physically weak, and avoided social interactions. Jennifer developed a fear of sleeping, chronic insomnia, and claustrophobia so severe that she couldn't use elevators. Another of the children, Larry Park, exhibited frequent irritability towards children, struggled with emotional regulation and self-harmed, even resorting to drugs to cope with his psychological issues. This demonstrates that even though the victims escaped the dark bunker that year, the immense trauma haunted them, making their lives difficult due to the psychological scars of being buried alive in the cold, dark earth.